Hi, welcome to Servant Leadership, an Introduction. This is part of the Workforce System Design Leadership Academy, Session 3. In this session, we'll be talking about servant leadership and how it impacts learning, leading, and engaging employees. It's part of a 5-part series on leadership, where we discuss managing self and others, managing conflict and differences, managing personalities and attitudes with MBTI, and leading performance and organizational transformation, a discussion on Lean Six Sigma. This particular segment is on leading discipleship. Servant leadership. If I ask my 12-year-old daughter what servant leadership is, she'll speak about a dominant relationship, maybe slavery, maybe serving others. If I ask young people in the workplace today about servant leadership, many of them will see it as a relationship between one who is in charge and one who's being told what to do. Servant leadership is a philosophy, really. It's not a method, it's not an action, it's not a tool. It's not something that you can just make and see on a sheet of paper. Servant leadership is a way of thinking and a way of leading that puts those who typically serve in roles where they're served by their leaders, those in the authority. When I was once in the military, I remember the first time I saw a senior leader, a colonel, and a sergeant major serving food in the chow line or in the dining facilities. This was a way to show those that they led that they cared about them and they wanted to make sure that they were taken care of. But it was a very different way of thinking, because most of the time when I thought about leaders, I was thinking about people who controlled or people who were responsible. So when you think about leadership or servant leadership, what words come to mind? Servant leadership, or something like it, has been around for quite a while. Some trace it back 2,600 years. Some speak about it in terms of places or geography or religions. In the Hebrew tradition, there were examples of leaders who served or took care of others. And then for many who profess the Christian faith, when we think about servant leadership, we think about the writings in the gospel, especially those of Matthew. In the Holy Scriptures of the Hi, my name is Professor Richard Ray. This is an introduction, Servant Leadership. This is part of the Workforce Systems Design Leadership Academy, Session 3. This is part of the overall servant leadership course that's taught in the Leadership Academy, where we talk about things like managing self and others, self-awareness, and managing conflict and differences, especially around civility and conflict management, managing personalities using the MBTI and other attitudinal assessments, and then leading performance and organizational transformation using tools like Lean Six Sigma and others. And of course, in this part of the course, we talk a little bit about leading discipleship, and we'll talk about how when we talk about servant leadership, it really is about discipling a different way of leading, using a more transformational style of leadership, where we continue to value the actions of transactional leaders, but we understand that in order to truly transform organizations, we have to take a servant leader's approach. Servant leadership is really a philosophy. It's understanding not that there's a tool or a special wand or fairy dust or something that you sprinkle on leaders and ta-da, they're effective. Servant leadership is a philosophy that requires an understanding of how leaders develop and how leaders lead, and maybe even more importantly, how followers follow. So the model that we're going to present to you, it is a philosophy, but it's one that you can apply to a lot of the work that you do in the organization. So what is servant leadership? If If I were to ask my 12-year-old daughter, she would say that it has something to do with waitresses or waiting. If I ask other people in the workplace who haven't been exposed to it, they might automatically assume that there's a subserviency that occurs, or maybe oppression, or maybe some domination that occurs. But for you, when you think of servant leadership, what do you think? Servant leadership, or something like that, has been around for nearly 3,000 years. Most of it has been through spirituality or religious perspectives, but we're seeing it more and more applied in organizations and colleges of businesses and in workplaces where people are trying to discuss a way of leading that allows the person in their authority to act differently than perhaps they have in the past. Lao Tzu is an example of this, where we look, and he wrote quite a bit on leadership. A couple of quotes here, or a couple of examples here, is the highest type of ruler is one whose existence people barely are aware of. And then the next level is leaders that people love and praise. And then it gets down to there are leaders who come to leadership through fear. And then there's some leaders that people will respond to and follow out of despise or deference. Another philosophy attributed to Lao Tzu was the idea that when you're lacking in faith, others will be unfaithful to you. It's sage and self-effacing, and when we think about the work that we do we think that we've done something as leaders, or that our employees have achieved something? So this is that idea, according to Lao Tzu. The worst leaders lead by coercion, and they do their bidding by force. There are also leaders who lead by threat and intimidation, and people obey them out of fear. Some leaders are led by promising their followers, and they try to do their bidding by rewarding people for things that might come in the future. Some leaders lead by persuasion, where they try to influence and convince others that they are right. Another type of leader is one that they lead by example. They're pace setters. People follow them because they respect what they've done. And then finally, according to Lao Tzu, the best leaders are, again, those that when all the work is done, they pat themselves on the back and say, we did it ourselves, not even noticing the leader role. In the 2nd century BC, we had Chanakya write that the king shall be considered good if he acts on not what pleases himself, but what pleases his subject. The king is a paid servant, enjoys the resources of the state together with the people. Essentially, the leader is good if he helps others, and he enjoys working with others and using those resources to others' benefit. Now, for many of us that have heard about servant leadership, they know it from a Judeo-Christian perspective. Specifically in the New Testament of the Holy Scriptures, we see several references to something called servant leadership. Jesus called them together and said, you know that there are those regarded as rulers of the Gentiles. They lord over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. This is not the way with you, as he was speaking with his disciples. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the greatest servant of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. This is from the Gospel of Mark. In Mark and Matthew and Luke, and in the letters that Paul wrote to various churches, you see this again. For instance, in Matthew, be But whoever would be great among you must be a servant, and whoever would serve among you must be a slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for others. Now, how many of you know leaders who would actually give their life as a ransom to those that report up to them? In the modern era, we have examples from Robert Greenleaf's essay, The Servant Leader, from 1970. Essentially, the servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then, a conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead and to serve. That person is sharply different from one who is a leader first, perhaps because of the need to assuage an unusual power drive or to acquire material possessions. Or if you look at the work of Will Sparks in his Actualized Leadership Profile, you can see that some people are motivated by achievement, or motivated by power, or motivated by affiliation. But essentially what we're looking for here is the leader first, servant first, are two extreme types, and between them is where we find the best leadership. Larry Spears identified 10 characteristics of servant leadership: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to growth of others, and building community. Bowman and Dill and Covey also reference these characteristics and other similar servant characteristics as essential components of effective leadership. And then another modern views, Sipe and Freck identified 7 pillars of servant leadership. They're individuals of character. They put people first, again, skilled communicators, compassionate collaborators, and they use foresight and systems thinking as they exercise moral authority. De Larocque identified in his writing, Leadership at Work, that there were 3 kind of categories that distinguish servant leaderships in the workplace. Their key priorities, the 3 key priorities, are developing people, building a trusted team, and achieving results. Key principles: serve first, persuasion, and empowerment. And 3 key practices: listening, delegating, and connecting followers to mission. The Center for Servant Leadership at Georgia, as part of the Pastoral Institute, defines servant leadership as a lifelong journey that includes discovery of oneself, a desire to serve others, and a commitment to lead. William Turner, who was the chief executive of W.C. Bradley Company and at one point the secretary of the board for Coca-Cola, he wrote a book where he identified 10 characteristics of servant leaders, and that he espoused that these leaders continuously strive to be trustworthy and self-aware and humble and caring and visionary. They empowered people, and they were relational. They were considered competent by those that were their peers, and more importantly, competent by those that reported up to them. They were extremely good stewards of resources, and they were, again, community builders. Regardless of your definition of servant leadership, one of the key elements is around engaging followers. And followers have to be ready. And essentially there's a couple of ways to think about readiness. Is a person able to do the work? Do they have the capability to act? Do they have knowledge and skills and experience to allow them to perform the task being required by leaders? And then the other element is willingness. Does the employee have the confidence, the commitment, the motivation to accomplish certain tasks? Again, we can look back to Dr. Sparks' view in Actualized Leadership, where we're not only trying to determine is the person capable, but are they willing? And when you combine capability and willingness, you can pretty quickly come up with a readiness distinction. So servant leadership is, again, a philosophy, a way of being, a way of thinking. It's something that often you'll hear executives say, I am a servant leadership, or my employees call me a servant leader. But I'll share with you an example of whether you buy into servant leadership or not. You can probably think of this person. A few years ago, I was in the CEO's office of a major financial organization. And as a part of the conversation, the CEO gave me their business card. Their business card was a beautiful business card worthy of any president of a multi-billion-dollar firm. But instead of CEO and president, someone had scratched through it and handwritten servant leader. So it was the person's name, and instead of their title that was printed on the card, it was scratched out and someone had written servant leader. Well, of course, it was the president himself who had written servant leader on his card. And as we were walking out, the chief financial officer looked at me and said, take a good look at that card. That's the only place you're going to see servant leadership coming out of that office. And I think that said something to me about how we think about servant leadership. And so as we close this presentation, I'm going to suggest that there's probably 14 characteristics of a servant leader. First, integrity. Do I believe you? Do I trust you? Do I find you credible? And do I find you consistent? Do I respect you? Vulnerability. Am I able to take a look at me and my faults, my strengths, my weaknesses, and I'm able to share those in a way that help craft the narrative for how I want to be as a leader. Discernment. Can I look at data? Can I get good information? And can I make better decisions? Can I make competent decisions? Awareness for the human spirit. This is simply, do I understand the value of people's contributions, and can I look for those contributions in any person at any level in the organization? This might even include things like understanding how wellness impacts the workplace, or who in my organization is a trusted confidant to others, who's looking out for the best interests of other employees. Servant leaders have courage in relationships. They can say the positive and the negative. They can engage their friends and those who they disagree with, and they can do it in a way that shows respect and courage. Sense of humor, especially these days, we seem to have regulated humor to a lower level in organizations for any number of reasons. But a servant leader does not take himself or herself too seriously, and they're able to laugh, and they're able to understand the humor in any situation. Probably my favorite characteristic of servant leadership is intellectual energy and curiosity. There are many people who are smart. There are many people who've been trained, but there are fewer people who have an intellectual curiosity to learn and try to adapt and try to appreciate the possible scenarios in any given situation. Respect for the future. A good servant leadership is able to work in the immediate space, but they're also able to understand that that space may not exist a year from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. And how they plan and how they act and respect the future can often determine whether or not the company survives. And just as important as respect for the future is a regard for the present. So knowing where you're at, knowing where your feet are. Often these two are considered part of the cognitive complexity conundrum. Can I operate and act in my immediate space, but do I also have the ability to look to the future without losing my place? Combine this with an understanding of the past. Servant leaders understand that culture and artifacts, values, and underlying assumptions are built cultures based on what that culture has experienced. So understanding the past and how to engage the past in a respectful way, but also helps put an eye on the future, is important. Servant leaders are predictable. We mean this in the context that they're not erratic. They're not going to be driven by up and down emotions or quick responses or quick reflexes to a situation where they may not have all the data. Breadth, that's simply understanding not only the narrow focus that you're working on as it relates to the business or working with a group of people, but also understanding the broader context of what they're doing. Comfort with ambiguity. Servant leaders have to be okay not knowing the future. That's not to say that they're laissez-faire and they throw up their hands when they don't have an answer or don't see an answer. What this simply means is they're able to operate without shutting down, without freezing, without giving up. And then the last characteristic of servant leadership that is important for our conversations is presence. Present to understand your place in time, presence to understand how you are going to lead and what your role in that leadership is. I spent the last 21 some odd minutes talking about what servant leadership is. And the truth is, you can find multiple definitions of servant leadership like you can find multiple definitions of transformational leadership. I would say that the concept of serving as a leader is still new for many people. And we have to be okay with people responding in ways that we might not have expected. So, as you continue in your learning journey, as you continue to think about the type of leader you want to be and whether or not you want to engage as a servant leader, here are some future reading materials that might be of interest. So thank you for spending this time with us. I hope this introduction to servant leadership will benefit you as you go forward, as you prepare for your assignments, and as you think about your role in the workplace. If you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out to us at rray@workforcesd.com. You can reach us in our Atlanta, Dallas, or Greenville offices, or until October, you can reach us in Washington, D.C. as well. Thank you and have a great learning.